Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's fine, and I suppose you'll have print time this weekend around the vicinity and our scenic views surrounded by mountain and many tourist sites, you know. So recently, I've noticed that a small solo businesses in Gwangju, largely being deprived and by shutdown the doors. On Friday, I usually have lunch. I order pizza. Do you like a pizza? I ordered a piece of pizza, which is made of some distinct elements now grown in our neighborhood. So it is Koreanized pizza and tastes very fanciful. It's so what I see in the context, we have some time now to reconsider the one-way drive of a developmental state paradigm. Now, we actually generally considered as one of the developed countries in the world. You see, in WTO governance, there are a set of provisions favoring the underdeveloped group of countries. That is actually contrary in principle with the equitable treatment or some non-discriminatory policy. There are some controversies about a sense of fairness and also some equity concept normally held through our neighborhood. There are different perceptions and quite distinct arguments in viewing the concept of fair trade between the developing countries and developed countries or underdeveloped countries. Now, Korea actually long ago had graduated from the privileged status as an underdeveloped country. We are now a member of OECD. Its membership typically signifies its status as a developed country. So what I mean is to recast our usual adherence about the growth of the economy. If entering into the status of a developed economy, I would rather expect there is a small percentage of economic growth usually. So we should get out of that past position and some our mindset or attitudes about high rate of economic growth. That means we have to suffer like a developed country. And we need to retrospect our labeled in a square aspect. We have to see some focus about our entertainment business, for example, and also for development history or cultural contents. Also, one sector we need to consider. Of course, a technology area seems to be important, apparently, and for many convincing reasons. Now, without the technology development, you would suffer over long term. So we need to invest in science education and also a technology concern of Korean people. And in that context, polarization may occur. So one solo business or small practices also have to take on a serious approach to about a personal dealings. So, it is proper to manage on this capital, or how do we compete with other similar businesses? So now, this competitive times require all people to be more strategic and wise and knowledgeable with the change of our society. It's many points. So you are a college student, and we also are very concerned about job prospects. So I recognize the pizza house I popularized on on every Friday of the week. It's really a creative, and I like it very much. And once I noticed very interesting interaction among the professors. Well, you know, our labor law professor named Hong Chair was actually a pro-activist about environmentalism. He encouraged members of the campus to support and participate in the context. And also there are strong needs actually, and the movement has a long tradition across the country. So he actually as a member of a nationwide network. You see, it is also tendency that the groups of intellectuals in developed country also concerned about. We see two contrasts, which might be a fundamental in current framework of a world economy, a developmentalist and versus environmentalist. One is popular dichotomy, usually employed by the circle of scholars. So how do you see if the nuclear power plant should be removed from Yeonghwa? So the opposing view is very persuasive. I read through the two postings available on the public notice of inter-campus communication. Very persuasive. Some might argue that Professor Che should be wrong. Should be right, since the capitalist, which might be a national monopoly in some key areas, like the nuclear power plant, exploit the natural resources for in the most interest? Is it natural? Or is it a legitimate, as argued by one colleague from United States? Well, which should bear the cost or sacrifice from the damage of environmental damage, air pollution, or other new ones produced by big factories or other big capitals? That is the cost for our consumer, normal citizens, or some salaried work. In some sense, you may say it unjust, but in other sense, they are critical to develop our society. So how to find the interaction, the context of a philosophical or a political framework is certainly a difficult area which requires in-depth and thorough, in some contexts, a thorough analysis. So there is beyond our discussion, of course, and it is actually in relation with other topics. But I raise the question if they are dominant over our environment. So the opposing professor's viewpoint is very intriguing and given in a clarified way by making it a highlighted with underline. So I partially be persuaded, but actually his key point of delivery seems to lie in a remote chance of an incident. How do you see it a problem? The nuclear plant was very effectively to address our basic needs. You use car and you use refrigerator or are involved. If we are in remote sense with the risk and barriers that pose a problem. Nuclear power plant should be seen in that light. Do you agree? I once read a case, titled a Beaufort incident, which is notorious about actually international trade law. The case involves the scope of issues about a procedural matter, a production of evidence in courtroom, or so that raises the context of a proper jurisdiction. So that is the case involving the principle of non-forum convenience. There are many enabling rules to allow the exercise of the jurisdictional power. So in this case, the New York court may properly find the jurisdiction on legal basis, but they abstain from ruling the case. Principally, principal reason should matter with the easiness of a court proceeding. Heavy set of evidence in documented forms or other tangible forms, or actually lying in the jurisdiction of instance, where the massacre, where the catastrophic event occurred. So about 10,000 people died from the leakage of fatal chemicals. So that is one of typical illustrations we usually refer when you think about an environmental issue. So the professor saw that incident could be usual on our daily experiences. Let's see. The misfortune of airplane flying from Korea to United States or other destinations, but may fail. And also, you can see automobile accident. So a recent statistics about the accident in Gwangju. About 2 days ago, a victim went in death by traffic accident. So, on some reason, it is obviously true that the statistics would favor his case. Probably it should come short if the victims were calculated in aggregate about the case of nuclear plant when we compare that with that of a airplane accident or a traffic accident. So I'm not definite about two positions actually, but it is in the, I just see that we have plenty resources of academic debate among our peer professors. So I spent unnecessary with other stories around us. We need to continue on the legislative problem raised by Professor Dawson. So it actually exchanges greatly with the peers of the European continent, and it's a precious chance to have some point of lesson from his delivery of the article. So, what? As I've said, his tone is both critical in some sense and inquisitive in other aspect, and support the system in many aspects. If we exchange our ideas, as I've introduced in our campus example, Joseph campus, debate and discussion, interchange of ideas, may contribute to production a better recognition or a narration. So the Professor Dawson's case is also in that context, and we have been interested. And in that ambit, a College of Department of Law, Chosun Law, also regularly hold an international conference where many scholars of initiation participate, particularly scholars from China, mainly China, Taiwan, and also from Japan are a popular invited to make the argument or case with some propositions to enrich our academic resources. So if that case comes within your availability, then I strongly advise to interact or attend the conference. So you can see this article in that dynamics. So it is insightful. In last case, I have enchanted some story, a book story, which was given to us about the practice of travel of elite groups in European Union. For example, the graduate of Oxford University usually expose themselves to several years of a tour through France and Italy. That is also a part of a culture or our pattern of intelligence to increase, augment our experiences through vast areas. So, in the history, you can see many great persons are usually active traveler. But if I'm dubious about the trend in this technological era, how do you oppose? We have many electronic tools to make us to extensively experience. We don't have to travel in this contemporary time. Do you agree? So that is also, that may be also circumstantial. Yeah, you can imagine if how they could acquire their readings or other crucial information without travel. I'm dubious if a printing technology was available at the time. Or, it should be if we have many books, but in some case, they have to write in person by pen. For example, the Federalist paper is one of notable examples now archived in a National Congress of the United States. They didn't use a printing machine. They have to write on their own hand. It is one of the documents to have a useful reference to understand the Federal Constitution of the United States. So, actually, it is amazing to see the environment of ours. So, Do you agree? If we are heavily owed to capitalist initiative, we have this material prosperity. What benevolence is it? So, in the professor's presentation, I like to pick up some insights to offer, to make a case to benefit the civil law lawyers. It includes actual lessons, although he phrased in some indirect ways. So he raised the question. My question from a Professor Dawson is whether a strong sense of identification with the governing leadership in Germany could have made judges of the earlier time more confident and more ready to assume a responsibility for discerning and promoting the general welfare, invoking for this purpose the moral authority conferred on them by the court. So there would be a little controversy about a legitimation in the German juridical system, but how do we substantiate? How do we become a competent jurist on a diverse forces from the society in general? We have to be kind of sociologist in some case. We have to have some knowledge of person about the scientific truth in any other case. Of course, we frequently use a expert testimony in court rooms. I've suggested the contribution judges can make will diminish in both credibility and usefulness as they move out and away from the primary function, what is deciding and explaining why they decide cases. In my own view, this fade out occurs still more rapidly when the justification for the decision must depend, at least in part, on moral ideas existing independently of any legal rules. By this, I mean that the moral ideas are made to appear not merely as supportive, but as filling a gap, large or small, in debatable legal laws. For I believe the judges are not endowed by their roles of office with superior insight into moral issues. More than this, it seems to me that for most moral questions of any importance or difficulty, there are no answers that are self-evidently right, even to judges. Since the answers are and will remain a contingent and debatable, any reasons given by judges to depend on them must be even more than usually tentative and revocable. So in his perception, we can see some general words, for example, a good morals, good faith, or conscience, which should be practical in your civil law cause. You should be actually faced with in the first class of civil code with this term, good morals, good faith. So that also comes in circular, as I said. Then the civil law judges may neglect on by making themselves some kind of a tentative explorer or revocable. How do you perceive the state decisis, rule of state decisis rule in contrast with this viewpoint? Common law judges will certainly be more settled and in continuity with long traditional laws. And also, the decision of a civil law jurist may be revocable since we have no rule of state decisis. So his perception is some provoking some lessons about our routine practices. Do you agree if the common law jurors could be more accurate and persuasive to deliver the specific justice? Do you think if we have to be more engaged through the cases in a missionary way? That is a vague and all variability in many strands of interpretation. So it is actually not a simple question. It should be deliberated in many aspects of practices. But we might not deny that our facial impression about this comment that there could be some possibilities that civil law jurists may fail or neglect on this point. So it is one moment to have derived some insights about our and so as title connotes, we need to have time in short fashion about a legitimate question. We actually have long history about Western democracy. You can see the sophistication of a Socrates dialogue or a Plato's Republic is classic, available to a vast number of college students. You can recall the document with a little effort in this contemporary time. Paradoxically, Plato did not see democracy as an idealistic form of a republic. You can see it is worst form, actually. It is worse than monarchy or oligarchy. In his viewpoint, most desired form of a republic would pertain to a Sparta or Crete, which was ruled by a absolute monarch, but who is very benevolent and intelligent. So in that context, what we call a polis in Greece, in ancient Greeks, the legitimacy should certainly lie in most acceptable monarch. Of course, there is a inchoate idea leading the concept of expelling the monarch, which is what you call tyranny. Origination could be conducted in the form of a collective vote to expel tyrant from the area of a police. That idea also was transplanted in the modern thinkers, who John Locke. He argued the legitimacy of a regicide or rebellion against tyrant. So legitimate question is fundamental. You can see the question in other contexts. You may work in private firms after you graduate from a department. So you have a higher loan who command job order and organize the workforce in a coherent fashion. Yeah. So more effective interaction about the organized structure. So the legitimacy may derive from your higher office. That might be more intensified if you serve the government employee, government office, and public office. Usually we have some fundamental shift in terms of a legitimate question, what is now popularized in political discourse about the bureaucratic revolution. So the theory to sustain capitalist society was organized to boost the social structure. And in the late 1980s through the early 20th century, with some other legitimacy, which was based in a communist ideology. So that is current exposure we usually experience in our daily world politics. Of course, there are a persuasive argument to say the demise of ideological conflict. That is true in most an extensive points of consideration, but still we can see some context of that dynamic. And particularly, that distinction would pertain to our class purpose. There are separate a source of legitimacy. For example, in my personal view, the socialist countries usually derive their authority from a political and economic ideology. So they see the working class as sovereign group in the nation. They prioritize and actually expel the anti-communist holders of idea. In some sense, many human rights have been disparaged, what I could not conform in this time. Allegedly true, but might be actually true also. And so, legitimate question. And his argument are related with the separation of power principle in some context, and also the idea of a democratic governance, democratic representation. there should be some areas of constitutional practices which are not specifically addressed by written provisions. But we have some basic context in separation of power principle in the United States. And if the legitimate question is so serious, we can derive some artificial way to offer the basis of legitimacy. For example, the United States Supreme Court justice have been appointed by the president, who was elected by independent election. And he, actually we call the system as presidential one. And so he, and on the other hand, some legitimate ground based on presidential election, which is distinct from the election of a United States Congress. So his basis of legitimacy may permeate in some indirect way into the support of a Supreme Court authority. And also we can contextualize the Constitution as the expression of a supreme will of people, and it may be based on Article 3 in the Constitution also. There are many ways to support his case on a legitimate question. Particularly, I like to recall about the parliamentary system now practiced in European states. So in his perception, the parliamentary system a factor to shape this kind of interaction, a general principle given by the legislature, which is placed in the core of a power. So they could conduct their business under the authority which pose no challenge in theory and the structural terms of government. But the present system also not so weak on that point, in my view. And his dealings is very inquisitive to raise both criticism and a enthusiasm about a civil law jurist. So I've now exhausted all his points of argument, and I'll defer to your further study. And now we have to articulate in a brief fashion about fields of substantive law in civil law nations. We have some background in relatively in detailed fashion, but it is the discourse which touches on the contemporary context of a substantive laws. And as the topic involves the civil law tradition, it is more helpful if we take a look at public law and private law in a framework. So, comparative legal analysis can be a relatively simple matter when the jurisdictions being compared share common legal structures, procedural rules, and similar ideas about how legal problems ought to be classified. An American lawyer, for example, will hardly reflect on the everyday process of consulting the law of sister states for guidance on a difficult or controverted legal question. Legal comparison may be dangerously misleading, however, when they take place between systems with different legal institutions, different procedural settings, and different methods for classification of legal rules. Varying rules of procedure, for example, may produce substantially different outcomes in cases in two legal systems with identical substantive rules governing the type of case. Apparent diversity in rules, on the other hand, may be substantially erased when the rules are seen in the proper institutional and procedural context. In particular, the distinctive ways in which different legal systems identify and deal with legal problems may pose obstacles for the comparatist. Consider, for example, the continuing importance of the historic distinction between legal and equitable rules and remedies in the common law, and the difficulties it must pose for comparatists from civil law countries where the division between law and equity is unknown. The categories according to which civil law lawyers are accustomed to arrange the legal rules are similar from country to country to greatly aid a transnational communication within the civil law orbit. So you encountered the word equity and equitable rules and remedies. So as we later review, this concept is very traditional, and which is compatible in some aspect with the general rules. Okay, you're busy on next class. You have to hurry up. The next class. So, do you have his name? Do you have his name? And you can return to class with the website I once informed. You can be available of the rest of our lecture on the screen. I've uploaded just a class recordation, videotape lecture available. Don't worry. The next class. So, compatible and is a very traditional rule which also now have powerful force, but in some limited extent. I'll let you be exposed to the concept later in the common law tradition. The categories according to which civil law lawyers are accustomed to arrange the legal rules are similar enough from country to country to greatly aid transnational communication within the civil law orbit. Yeah. But they are sufficient different from common law categories to constitute an obstacle to civil law common law comparison. The fundamental division in all civil law systems is between public and private law. The classification, which is only latent or implicit in the common law, is basic to understanding of the civil law. We have already seen how closely it is tied to the organization of court systems of civil law countries. as public law disputes became justifiable in the 9th century and separate court systems were created to handle them. The jurisdiction of the older courts is limited to disputes governed by private law, with one major exception of criminal matters. Besides the jurisdictional consequence, the public-private law distinction also describes a division of labor within the legal profession. The members of law faculties tend to be either publicists or privatists. Courses and treatises tend to focus on one or the other area, despite the fact that today any given subject matter is apt to have a public law aspect. Despite the universal recognition of the distinction within the civil law world, there is no agreement of civil law lawyers on its theoretical basis or justification, and no uniformity among countries as to scope and effects. Generally speaking, however, public law includes at least constitutional law, administrative law, criminal law, while private law includes at least civil law and commercial law. The proper classification of several other areas is the subject of dispute. Civil procedure, for example, is included by some systems within the private group of subjects and treated by others as public law. Labor law, agricultural law, social security, as well as a number of other modern regulated areas are sometimes said to be mixed public and private areas, and sometimes described as sui generis. So, how do you see a public law and civil law tradition? Although the public-private law distinction has lost in Roman law, public law remained a relatively undeveloped category until modern times. It was preserved of sovereign, prudently left aside by jurists. As we noted in this historical introduction to the civil law tradition, nearly all the Roman legal literature that has come down to us is concerned with private law, and legal science traditionally has concentrated on private law. We observe, too, that in the localism and legal diversity of the Middle Ages, there was no place for public law. But when the centralized state and its administrative organs began to emerge on the continent, conditions were favorable to the development of administrative law. In the 19th century, as administrative law began to flourish, it seemed to civil law lawyers that the ordinary private law rules that apply to disputes involving private individuals or associations could not simply be carried over to the relationship in which the state was a party. In France, it seemed that the ordinary court could not be entrusted with the task of resolving disputes involving the state. The French view of separation of powers led, as we've seen, to the establishment of a separate set of public law courts within the administration. In Germany, however, concern about administrative oppression was more prevalent than a minister of judiciary. So, to avoid having disputes between a citizen and administration adjudicated by the latter, Germany created a separate system of administrative law courts within the judiciary. Today, as the French Council of State has established its own independence from the administration proper, advanced the protection of individual rights, and extended its own control over the administrative process. The fact that it technically not a court is of diminished importance. In modern civil law states, where on the French or German model, the tendency has been to increasingly effectively view of the legality of administrative action. Today, when one speaks of public law in the civil law systems, what is meant is often merely administrative law, a constitutional law that pertains to the form and structure of state and its organs, still so of as being akin to the political science. As you've seen, it is only in relatively recent times the courts or other institutions have acquired the power to review the constitutionality of the acts of government. As for criminal law, though technically classified as public law, it has traditionally been the concern of the privatists and everywhere falls within the jurisdiction of the ordinary courts. Thus, the bulk of public law in civil law countries, in fact, consists of administrative law. It is hard to define precisely what is included within the concept of administrative law, even within a single country. Generally speaking, it consists of the norms which regulate the organization, functions, and interrelations of public authorities other than the political and judicial authorities, and the norms which govern the relationships between the administrative authorities and citizens. Tax law has become a major specialty within this field. Administrative law does not completely coincide with the jurisdiction of administrative courts, because in all civil law countries, certain administrative matters are relegated by special legislation to the jurisdiction of the ordinary court. It is primarily in the field of administrative law that the distinctive characteristics have developed which are sought to set public law apart from private law in the civil law systems. The most obvious of this is the uncodified state of administrative law. The fact that the great codification left public law untouched accentuated the division between private and public law. The separation deepened as the courts assumed a large role in establishing the general principles and rules of administrative law, a role formerly denied them in the area of the civil law. At the present time, administrative law in civil law systems tends to be scattered among various statutes, with case law playing a major role. The relative importance of the case law is greater in France. That of enacted law is greater in West Germany and Austria. You can see the publication of a Korean course, which is usual or encouraged with you, for your class. You probably should have a broad publication regularly for the class. Your professor must lead them in that way. For understanding, in your the publication, you can see vast number of codes or statutes, which are generally of administrative nature. So, the dominant part of a statute code in Korea are now administrative, or may properly fall within the scope of a administrative law. And also, we have unitary system about between the public law jurisdiction and private law jurisdiction, which is a little unusual in some sense against the civil law peers. For example, you have diverse branches of court in Germany, and also a strict separation between a good cassation and a French French Council of State. As might be expected, public and private law will not necessarily arrive at different solutions to similar legal problems. Nevertheless, the student of comparative law must always be aware of the possibility that the classification of a dispute as a private or public will bring into play a quite different substantive rule or different method of interpretation. For example, in France, during the 7 inflations after World War I, the private law courts refused to grant relief to creditors whose a fixed contractual claim had become practically worthless, while the Council of State developed the doctrine of a unforeseeability to come to the aid of breaches in contracts governed by public law. Administrative law is said to be set apart from private law by its susceptibility to a frequent change. By the wider scope, it allows for official discretion, and the little room it leaves to the direction of the parties, and by smooth, vague, and fluid legal concepts. However, it should be noted that the general principles of private law are often carried over to supplement or to fill gaps in administrative law. Okay, I'd like to ask a 10 more minutes to complete a private law. Is it okay? So, for that. Just as the term public law is commonly used to designate administrative law, a private law is often used interchangeably with civil law. In civil law system, however, private law comprises two grand divisions of its own, civil law and commercial law. Civil law, in principle, applies to everyone, and its basic provisions are found in the civil code, supplemented by auxiliary statute. Commercial law, which concerns a specific groups of persons and of specific types of activities, is in most civil law countries arranged in a separate commercial code. In Italy and Switzerland, there are no commercial codes, but a commercial law nevertheless is considered and taught as a separate private law subject. Besides commercial law, there are a number of other fields which are actually classified as separate from civil law, but within the domain of a private law. Literary and artistic property, maritime law, insurance and industrial property. Labor law developed from the civil law of the individual employment contract. However, today it is variously classified as a special category of a private law, as mixed public and private law, or as being a field unto itself, neither public nor private. In the new legal private law, we therefore have two sets of legal areas, what are called civil law and a commercial law. A civil law is traditionally arranged in treatises and for teaching purposes on the following major headings: the law of persons, family law, marital property law, a property law, succession law, and the law of obligations. So I suppose you should have been exposed to these sections in general understanding of a civil code. These categories are not exhaustive, nor do they precisely correspond with the way the subjects are distributed within civil codes of various countries. In Switzerland, for example, there is a separate code of obligations, and in France, a family law is included within the law of person. You can see the book title, picture, in the name of law of obligations. The law of obligation is the most technical, abstract, and still part of civil law. It covers all acts or situations which can give rise to rights or claims, and is customarily divided into three parts: the law of contract, the law of tort, and the law of unjust enrichment. The contract law sections of the code typically begin with rules which are applicable to all contracts, and then set for special rules for particular sorts of contracts, says leases, agency, loans, etc. The civil law conception of tort liability is a unified one, in contrast to the common law, which developed a separate pigeonholes for different kinds of harm. It is a law of tort rather than torts. The civil law of unjust enrichment has been built up from general principles with heavy component of case law. And on the first title, you have to see the law of persons. The law of persons consists of all the norms concerning the status of the individuals and legal entities which are the subjects of the law. It includes the legal rules relating to such matters as names, domicile, civil status, capacity, and protection of persons and the legal incapacities of various sorts. Most legal entities have long been subjected to special regulation by administrative, commercial, and labor law, so that only a few associations are now left within the domain of the civil codes. What are next? Family law covers marriage formation, the legal effects of marriage termination by divorce, separation and annulment, filiation, and family support obligations. The first of these areas, which has remained quite stable, the civil law systems have taken from the French the requirement of a civil ceremony for the formulation of a valid marriage. In all the other parts of family law, extensive code revision has taken place under the influence of the three major trends: the liberalization of divorce, the equalization of the position of women in the areas of family decision-making and property rights, and the assimilation of the status of children born outside legal marriage to that of a legitimate children. And within the family law, we have seen some sub-branch of marital property law, which, however, may be classed into other independent points of a consideration. A marital property law, with those links to family law, property law, and succession law, is traditionally treated as a separate area of civil law. The civil codes establish and regulate a legal regime, the system that governs the property relations of all spouses who do not choose an alternative regime by marriage contract. The legal regime is typically a form of a community property, usually with marital property and property acquired through gift or inheritance, kept separate if it can be identified as such. The modern trend favors forms of so-called different community in which the spouses are treated as separate owners of whatever they respectively acquire during the marriage. The property acquired during the marriage is divided equally upon termination of the marriage by divorce or death. In addition to establishing the legal regime, the marital property violations of civil codes typically establish and regulate a number of alternative regimes which may be chosen by contract, as well as the procedures for entering and altering a marriage contract. A property law in civil law system, what is our next concern, recognize a distinction between movable and immovable property, which roughly corresponds to the common law distinction between personal and real property. Historically, as in the common law, land was considered to be of greater importance than chattels, and the law of the older code especially reflects this. In the liberal tradition, the right of ownership was considered absolute, and the protection of a private property was regarded as an important function of the state. In fact, the absoluteness of property right, as described in the civil codes, has long since been extensively limited by public law legislation, by new constitutions, and by judicial interpretation. So the concept of land in to the public interest also arose. Context. A succession law. What is succession law? It covers disposition of property upon death by will or by intestate inheritance. Freedom of testation in civil law systems is typically limited in favor of teachers, testator children who are entitled to a reserved share of their parents' estate. Unlike American law, civil law systems do not traditionally accord such a forced share to the surviving spouse, whose economic interests are sought to be sufficiently protected by the division of marital property upon death. The modern trend everywhere, however, has been to improve gradually the successor position of the surviving spouse, and in some countries, West Germany, for example, this has brought about a reserve share in Israel's favor. So this system also incorporated into a current civil code, and on extensive level of a similarity, you can see some easy understanding of this introduction. Two typical aspects of civil law succession have attracted considerable attention in the United States in recent years. The first is the practice of having a will authenticated before a notary during the lifetime of testator, a procedure which dispenses with the need for probator and also. So the interchange of legal ideas and institutions could be augmented in recent times. And as we have surveyed the marital property law principles, most principles could be shared by both traditions. And I have to say a further mention about a law of obligation, which is relatively vast and important to understand the private law of a civil law tradition. Chief among the unifying factors within the law obligations are the expanded range of facts the modern courts consider legally relevant, the movement away from formalism and trends toward a protecting reasonable reliance and expectations. However, at the very time, the contractual and delictual responsibility appear to be covering the scope of the field of obligations, appears to be diminishing. At the outset of this section, it was stated that the law of obligations is at first sight the most stable area of the civil law. If one looks only at the civil code, the part containing the law of obligations have been a little changing, and they are recognizably related to the oldest parts of civil law tradition. Legislation outside the codes, however, has altered both the substance and the underlying philosophy of the law of obligations. And in the next class, we plan to have more time, which should be short, for the commercial law and some trend or merger or destitute of divisions. Before closing this class, I'd like to recall some of fundamental points where some context or basic understanding could be revealed. Let me present a question. The French comparatist Louis David once wrote, when one says public law, the Frenchman knows that it is not and cannot be law in the strict sense. Law in the strict sense can only develop in the area of relations between individuals where the state is an impartial arbiter. The phrase came from a French law, the Structure, Sources, and Methodology, published in 1972. And one other contrast in comment from Lenin, who was a political leader in the revolution, Bolshevik revolution, as you see. Lenin laid down the orthodox socialist view when he wrote, all law is public law. We'll be further debatable about the socialist legal system later in the class. What does each writer mean? Do you agree on the point of Lenin, David, or that of Lenin? What ideological assumption about law under each statement? Is there a sense in which each of these statements is true or false? So you can see some distinctive perception between the two traditions. Formalistically, they share many points of similarity, and systematically speaking, the socialist law are grossly based on the civil law traditions. But the substantive elements and the basic ways of a framework are different. Comes rather different. A socialist rather see the essence, the importance of a public law, which evinces in some aspect the supremacy of a political or economic ideology. But for the glossated tradition and also long history of a European legal system, Lenin David saw in perverting way, which should be original, but however, so he saw the intrinsics of law within the preserve of private law. So that is the point of meditation throughout the weekend. Sorry to neglect on time promise, and that will be all for this class. We'll see in the online two classes next week. Thank you.